So as we're looking at the brain right here, important thing to understand is, number one, it should be symmetrical. Whatever you see on one side, you should see on the other side. So the bad news is some of the models, like even the ones that we have and we'll discuss, you don't see that symmetry. This one you kind of do, right? So I know this model is coming from the actual model for the cerebrovascular kind of blood vessels of the brain. So we don't really use it as much, but this one stays together. That's why I like using it, whereas that other model doesn't. So keep in mind that the main cut that's found straight through the hemispheres right here is called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure has a piece of dura mater that separates the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. Fissures are large cuts where you're completely separating brain matter. That's opposed to small creases like we see here, right? So when we're looking for, like, let's say the central sulcus, we're gonna look to find two pieces of gyri, the brain matter, that runs parallel to each other. And you can see that these two kind of run parallel to each other. So once we see the two that runs kind of parallel to each other, and you can see it much better here, right? Once we see that, you will notice that when it runs parallel, you'll be able to see that this is the one that's a little bit more anterior. This one's a little bit more posterior, right? Now, when that happens, and I think you can see it better right here, when that happens, this middle crease is called the central sulcus. Anything in front of the crease is going to be part of the frontal lobe. This is your precentral gyrus then. The brain matter is folded into gyri, which are then separated by creases called sulcus or sulci. So here's a precentral, central sulcus, and then your postcentral gyri. Anything anterior to the central sulcus is part of the frontal lobe. Anything posterior to the central sulcus down here until the edge right here, this is part of the parietal lobe. Each lobe has specific functions. So the frontal lobe is pretty big, and it's going to see that this region right here is what we call the motor cortex, right? The motor cortex allows us to have movement of limbs, of fingers, of your tongue, of your mouth, right? All skeletal intended movements of the skeletal muscle starts with neurons found in the precentral gyrus. But these are just the neurons that kind of cause movement. In order to have nice, controlled, right, symmetrical movements that are smooth, we need a game plan on how to activate the neurons, right? Once you know how to activate the neurons, then you can activate the neurons properly, so then you have a nice, smooth movement. You can imagine if you're trying to, let's say, if you're trying to pour some coffee and your hands are shaking because you're trying to move them, well, you're gonna have a hard time pouring coffee, right? So you want that nice, smooth movement. And part of it is a combination of knowing which nerves to activate and which nerves to inhibit to have those nice, smooth movements. We don't think about it a lot, but think about all the different muscles you have to contract just to walk. Then you have to think about how you have to relax the opposite muscles, so then the intended muscles can move. We just think about walking, right? But the rest of the brain actually will take over. So then your activating muscles will get activated by nerve impulses. And then in order for movement to occur, you need to inhibit those antagonistic muscles as well, which is also controlled by the brain. Right? Again, anything anterior, frontal lobe, parietal lobe. Now, I'm going to take this one out, and once you take them out right here, we can kind of see something a little bit better right here. You can see at this point, right here, hopefully it just stays like this. This area right here, this is the temporal lobe region. The temporal lobe kind of wraps around, and then you have a large crease. That large crease region right there allows us to separate the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal. This is called the lateral fissure. So the lateral fissure is a big cut. And we're going to see in a second that in the lateral fissure region, it separates the two lobes, right? The temporal from the parietal and the frontal. Now, what else are we going to see is that if you take a look, this has multiple colors here. It's supposed to correspond to different types of functions for each region. Now, we're going to see in a bit that in terms of the brain region right here in the temporal lobe region, you have a region in orange and a region in yellow right here, right? These regions are supposed to, be important for Wernicke's region for speech, all right? Now think about what you have to do to be able to talk. You need to understand the words. You need to then, in order to talk, this Wernicke's area allows you to associate the word so then you can interpret what people are saying to you. And then when you have to talk, you need to send the information to the frontal lobe area over here called Broca's area, which is kind of like in red right here, right? The Broca's area is in front in the frontal lobe region, and it's very, very specified to move for motor neurons so then you can move your tongue in the appropriate way, move your mouth, move your vocal cords, so then you can make the proper words and sounds for speech, right? And if you think about that, all of our speech is found between a very narrow bandwidth, right? Between certain frequencies. It's really, you can kind of understand all the different sounds for each language, right? And how hard it is to interpret the sounds. It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to learn a new language. Now, with this as well, all right, we kind of went through some of this. One of the things that we will see here is this kind of a big check mark area right here. This is a corpus callosum. The corpus callosum region right here is where we are going to have the connection between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. Keep in mind, the left and the right hemispheres are completely separated from each other. So the only communication between one side to the other is this corpus callosum. Underneath the corpus callosum, you see this kind of little film right here. This is called the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum, if I could break through here, right, with the marker, I would enter one of the regions where we produce cerebrospinal fluid. It'd be a region we call the lateral ventricles, right? As we move down, then you'll notice that this region that's really shiny, this region right here is an area of the hypothalamus, right? And then with hypothalamus, this one doesn't show the pituitary gland, right? The other ones do, and the pituitary gland will stick out of this hypothalamic region. All right, you would think with how important the hypothalamus is, that it would be a little bit larger, a little bit more defined, right? If you take a look at it, it really doesn't look like much at all. Now,